This is on racquetball from my perspective beginning in 1968. 1968, I enrolled at Michigan State University in veterinary school. I was a clean-cut, naive, virgin athlete, scholar, fresh out of Jackson Parkside High School. Never drank a beer, never had a date. My worst vice was milkshakes. And here I was at big Michigan State University. The minute I walked into the MSU intramural building and saw my first paddleball court, I knew that was a sport I wanted. A quick backstory is I had never picked up any kind of racket or paddle prior to my senior year in high school. There I had tried out for the tennis team and actually made it to the final rounds of tryouts. Coach Keeley said, "Keeley, we don't take first year, senior tryouts, but I'll make an exception to this case. If you beat Ray McQuillan, our #1 player in singles, I'll let you on the tennis team." I did beat McQuillan. I went on and beat the #2 player in singles and tryout, and then Coach Keeley promptly kicked me off the team. I was always the second picked on any sports team in baseball, football, until I proved myself on the baseball field or the gridiron. I thought the same would be true at Michigan State when I looked down at court #1, which was the challenge court, and saw a man with a motorcycle helmet and a half dozen purple paddle balls, the old Pennsylvania paddle ball, and a wooden paddle. These were the old Marcraft paddles. Racquetball had not been invented yet in 1968. It had been invented, but no one, including me, had heard of it. Actually, my first one was plastic, perforated with holes. I looked down at Al Moradian, and he dropped and hit what I came to know were kill shots. Surprisingly, 9 out of 10 of his shots rolled off the front wall. Then he went to the backhand side, and probably with the percentage of 8 out of 10, he hit kill shot after kill shots for about half an hour. When he left, I asked him, "Al, why are you wearing those sunglasses?" First time we ever met. He said, "For guys like you, so they aren't blinded by my brilliance." Flash forward 1 month. Michigan State had a line of 9 courts. Court #1 was a challenge court. Court #2 to 8 were the everyday reserved by the hour courts. And court #9 was a handball challenge court. Upstairs, unbeknownst to many, were the sweaty, non-fanned 3 upper courts. And this is where I practiced day after day after veterinary school. Forward now to 1969. I meet Al Moradian, the guy with the motorcycle helmet and Pensy balls, who had blinded me by his brilliance. And for the first time in years, because he was a grad student, I defeated the defending paddleball champion and became the Michigan State paddleball champ. With each championship at Michigan State, one was given a green windbreaker that said MSU champion, and then it gave the sport. As years went by, I collected a closet full of these, used them to get dates, and in 1971 there was a fire that wiped out my whole wardrobe of windbreakers. That was my last date for a while. I had nothing left but the shirt on my back and a bow tie that we were required to wear in veterinary school. But I bought another paddle, some more balls, and continued to play paddleball. I won the Michigan State Paddleball Championship, singles, and then doubles nearly the whole time I was there, from 68, 69, 70, who knows how many years, until veterinary school ended in the winter of 1972. In 1970, I started the MSU Paddleball Club and started helping to throw tournaments there. We brought in players from Flint, Ann Arbor. At the time, the best players were from Michigan. I had one nemesis in paddleball, and that was Paul Lawrence. I had nightmares about him. He was so tall, his hands seemed to reach from one side wall to the other side wall, and he had my number while everybody else I could easily handle, and became second in the state time and time again behind Paul Lawrence. Finally, in 1971, the National Paddleball Tournament were held in Flint, Michigan, just 30 miles down the road from East Lansing, where I lived and was going to school. Now, at the time, vet school was very arduous. We had 17 to 19 credits per day. We had classes on weekends. There were no holidays except Christmas, and we went all summer. I would rather have drawn a low number in the Vietnam lottery and gone off to war to take my chances there. There were suicides every year in veterinary school. It was tough tough because I could run from the veterinary school a mile to the intramural building and play paddleball for 2 hours. Was in very good shape by the time the Nationals rolled around in 1971, but shaking in my Converse black tennis shoes because I had to ask Black Bart, the dean of the veterinary school, for 1 day off to go to the Nationals down the road in Flint, Michigan. I decided not to ask him. I went AWOL from veterinary school for the first time in my life. In 7 years, no sicknesses, not a single day of veterinary school missed, except for that Friday I hitchhiked 30 miles east to Flint, Michigan, and played in my first Nationals. People came in from all across the country, most notably from San Diego, California. There were a couple of characters, one called Dr. Bud Muehlheisen, everybody spoke about. I couldn't believe the things they said about the White Knight. Undefeated in badminton, undefeated in paddleball, and he would become basically the founder of racquetball. The other character who came out of San Diego, who was the number 2 seed, was his chum, Charlie Brumfield, whom I ended up writing a book about, his biography, Charlie Brumfield, King of Racquetball. Back then, I had never met either of them. Muehlheisen was a little bit older. I didn't scout him out at the Flint YMCA, but I was curious about this Brumfield for more than one reason. Charlie Brumfield wore a visor. He dressed in the most disheveled way. He had thick Coke bottle glasses, and he was quick off his toes in any direction. Besides that, he stumbled when he walked. He couldn't chew gum and trot at the same time, but he was an attorney or in law school at the time, and a very smart guy. I watched him above, I watched him roll shot after shot off in practice like a machine, and I thought, oh, this guy is something to contend with, but couldn't take him seriously just because he was such an odd-looking fellow. At the time, I was wearing a jockstrap headband to keep the sweat out of my eyes. My sweats were long john underwear. This was because I didn't have much money from a rural family that saved the money to put me through veterinary school. Nobody knew I went AWOL out of vet school, even my family. I walked into Flint, Michigan YMCA and scouted Muehlheisen and then Brumfield, had my first match, and then, as the papers would later report, Steve Keeley became the David who slew 3 Goliaths. I beat in quick succession Paul Lawrence, my nemesis, then Charlie Brumfield, then Craig Finger. An interesting thing happened in my first win, this one in Flint, Michigan over Paul Lawrence. It was the 3rd game in a close fought contest, and on a shot, the head flew off my paddle, and I stood there holding, like a popsicle stick, just the handle in my hand. Lawrence looked at me incredulously, and I said, keep playing. In the 3rd game, I beat him in 3. In the semifinals, I ran up against Brumfield, and it was horrendous. I had never encountered anything like that talking, hitting machine before in my life. He used the psych factor to win about 50% of the points. First thing he said as he walked in the court, he turned to the gallery and said, all right, you Michigan farmers, how many of you are for the people's champion? And he put his paddle over my head. Then he stepped away and said, now how many of you are for the great Charlie Brumfield? And put his paddle over his head, and everybody booed. With the crowd on my side, I won the first game. Charlie got tired in the second game. I was well on the way to winning the semifinals of the Nationals, and he started lob serving that just barely hit the side wall, back wall, rolled to the front wall. He walked slowly, picked it up. Each of these first fault serves took about 1 minute, so he got a 1 minute rest between every point. Recovered and won the second game. In the 3rd game, I thought I was getting to him because he looked sick, he looked winded. He hadn't gone to the bar every night and run from vet school to vet school and carried sick ponies from their stalls to the operating table and walked hundreds of kennels. He had been back sitting on his ass in San Diego studying law. I was ahead of him in the 3rd when he started pulling out all stops, sending shots at my earlobes, hitting me with the ball, threatening me with the paddle, and then he called a timeout, peeled back the tape off his handle, and started ribbing crib notes written on the wooden handle of his paddle from his mentor Carl Loveday. It was a tight third game, but I beat him. The next time I saw Charlie Brumfield, 5 minutes later, laying on his back, hit his head under the Gatorade machine, Gatorade pouring into his mouth. He saw me and shook his head back and forth and spit, and he said, "Nobody remembers second place." That put me in the finals against the defending champ, Craig Finger. Before the match, a guy named Chuck Leve came into the locker room, and he said, "My name's Chuck Leve. I write for Ace Magazine, and I'm here to cover the Paddleball Nationals. You're going in against a former national champ. What are your feelings about this?" And I said something like, what's his name? And he laughed, and I explained that I was in veterinary school, didn't get much sleep, and that I was more worried about getting back to vet school in time on Monday for my classes than I was in the finals against Finger. I had seen Finger play. He was a talented former squash champ, but all he could do is lob, 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 and cover the court like a little lizard. And I figured I could run him or shoot him, beat him any number of ways. It didn't even enter my mind that I might lose. There was no problem. I easily defeated Craig Finger and went back to vet school the next day. I remember walking into microbiology class, and the professor said, "I missed you Friday in class. Why didn't you tell me in advance?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to be honest with you. I had a chance to play in the National Paddleball Tournament. I've been practicing for years. I was the intramural Michigan State champion." He said, "How did you do?" I said, I won it. And he said, "Good job, catch up." I went to the microscope, the petri dishes, and resumed veterinary school. The first immediate effect of winning the Nationals in '71 was Charlie Brumfield gave me a call from San Diego, said, "I'd like to come out and visit you this summer, get in shape, and tell you about a new sport that's starting on the West Coast, especially in San Diego, called racquetball." He says, "I'm going to bring a rare thing, 2 racquetball rackets, the prototype for the Echelon Bud Muehlheisen aluminum racket, and some racquetballs, and we'll play paddleball if you want, and we'll play racquetball. I'd like to transition you to racquetball because I'm telling you, it's the sport of the future." And he did show up in East Lansing, Michigan. I was living in the house at the time on University Avenue with the Woolies band, who were also paddleball players. And we'd go down to Michigan State University and we'd play doubles. 2 and 3 Baldores and Brumfield and me switching off. And I learned all about the life, biography, antics, strategy, mind, and weirdness of Charlie Brumfield that summer. For 3 months we lived together in the Woolies house. I lived downstairs, and a washer that I turned on to listen to the washing machine so I wouldn't have to listen to the Woolies practice. Brumfield practiced basketball every day. He was a superb basketball player. When I got off vet school in the afternoon, I went over to the intramural building, and for the first couple of weeks we played paddleball. More racquetballs arrived from Bud Muehlheisen out in San Diego. We had enough balls, which were breaking all the time, to play racquetball, and we started playing that. Charlie explained to me the first day, the strategy's pretty much the same as paddleball, except in paddleball where we have lobs, in racquetball they have a thing called the ceiling ball. I said, "What's a ceiling ball?" And he demonstrated. Near the back wall on the left-hand side, he dropped the ball and hit the ceiling ball down the left side wall. It was a wallpaper shot, that is. It slid along the wall very closely. It was obvious that he had been practicing while I was in veterinary school, and this would become his forte to win the next couple of national championships. It was the first ceiling shot I had seen. Not only that, the way we tested racquetballs back then is we stood on the court, we dropped the ball from chest high, and if it bounced up to the waist, that was a lively ball. The second test was if we hit a good ceiling ball as hard as we could from the back wall, and it did not reach the crack between the floor and the back wall, that was a perfect ball. If it was too slow, we threw it out. If it was too fast and carried to the back wall, we threw it out or took air out of it with needles I got from the veterinary clinic. So we practiced ceiling ball after ceiling ball, day after day. We had spars. Brumfield always wanted to bet steak dinners. I didn't have money to buy steaks. I wasn't in the mood for steaks because that summer I was in necropsy, which is the animal form of autopsy. Charlie was like Paul Haber in that he was able to drink a couple six-packs and function very well. He told me at Lizards, you can acquire a taste for beer. He said, try this one. I drank it. It tasted terrible. He said, drink 2 of these every night and you'll acquire a taste for beer. He was trying to get me to become an alcoholic because we were playing pretty even in racquetball at the time. I was good at racket sports because I was an eccentric. There were no coaches in racquetball back then. I was self-taught beginning 2 or 3 years earlier in tennis, transferred those skills to racquetball. There was no books that I had read. There was no coaches other than observing Al Moradian, Craig Finger, Paul Lawrence, and guys like Muleisen and Brumfield. So I developed my own strokes. The most important thing I did that applies to any racket sport today is look the other way. This is a strategy. If I'm going to hit the ball to the right front corner in a kill shot, I look upper left. And of course, as the player is watching me over his shoulder, he sees me looking upper left, edges that way, and that's all I need is that quick half step to put the ball away in the right front corner. And if I wanted to do a pass down the left line, then I looked bottom right, and the player anticipated the exact opposite direction. In other words, it was an early version of the common strategy now of hit it where he ain't, only I induced him to move where it wouldn't be. The second thing I developed was difficult, but worth it. It took me about 2 weeks of practice in the upper sweaty courts until I got down hitting kill shots from waist high or above. This was unheard of. Al Moradian, Lawrence, Finger, Brumfield, Muleisen especially, would scrape the floor with their rackets in order to hit kill shots because then the ball would go in on a horizontal line and be less likely to skip. At the same time, whenever the opponent saw the player bend over to hit a kill shot, he just edged forward a step and covered it. It's all one of the main parts of anticipation. I countered that by taking kill shots only by hitting from waist high or higher up to the chest kill shots. Now, how did I do that? I'll reveal something I'd never had before on camera. I was a scientist, still am, had a scientific mind. What I learned from physics, air movement, ball dynamics, and playing with a yo-yo as a kid is to spin the ball so it can climb a ladder string and defy gravity. Let me explain it in terms of the racquetball. When I hit a kill shot into the right front corner from waist high, I spun the ball with in-spin along an axis about like this, going from 5 o'clock up to 11 o'clock with in-spin. The ball spun like this, the ball hit the air, and it rose. Not only that, if you spun it faster, it seemed to defy gravity in that it rose a la the yo-yo on the string, and it could not skip. They never skipped. Why didn't they skip? This is what nobody had figured out, is that the air is denser at the bottom of the court. It's cooler. Whenever there's cooler air, there's more friction. As the ball spun in that direction on the forehand and hit the denser air, it was like a stone skipping off a lake of air and could not skip in. And so I could literally close my eyes, hit the ball like that, and it would hone in on the target and roll off after roll off. And this is how I became national champ in paddleball year after year after year, and how I took the same stroke to San Diego for my first national singles invitational. My third year in veterinary school as the incumbent national champion in paddleball and practicing racquetball, I had a knee injury, toward a lateral meniscus on one of the knees, and still wanted to practice. So I had a walking cast on, nonetheless, went to the Michigan State courts and learned, because I couldn't bend my knees, to take the stroke on kill shots even higher and higher up to the chest, so that when I got to the back wall, on say the backhand side, I could turn, hit a backhand that would roll off into the front corner. Everybody said my backhand was my forte, it was my winning points, and it's true, because my forehand was slightly weaker, and everybody played to the backhand side. Nonetheless, the serves, the lobs, and in racquetball, the ceiling shots. And that's simply why I advanced and beat other people that I normally wouldn't have, is because once I got the walking cast off, I could kill the ball from literally head high into the front left corner. The walking cast came off after 2 or 3 weeks, and I went to the courts and practiced with a crutch. The doctor wouldn't let me play in tournaments, only solo practice. So I took a crutch in the court, had the paddle in the other hand, and practiced that way. Then he allowed me to play in an intramural doubles tournament, and we won the intramural doubles championship by me playing rarely on the forehand side for once. And I recovered from the knee injury and went on to win some more paddleball championships. In 1971, I won the National Paddleball Championship. Brumfield came out in the summer of '71, and I graduated from veterinary school in the winter of '71. Mel Gorham's was a premier court club in America. There were 6 courts. Number 1 was the exhibition court with the glass sidewalls. Courts 2 to 5, you had to walk through the locker room to get to. Women were starting to play a lot of racquetball in California, specifically in San Diego. Some champions came out of there, Betty Weed, Jan Campbell, and others. Whenever a female wanted to play, she had to be blindfolded or the locker room cleared. She would go through the locker room and play on 2 to 5. When her hour was up, or 2 hours, on with the blindfold again and back out to the front. I walked into the National Singles Invitational at Gorham's, and the first thing I saw on looking right was a line of bikini girls came up from the beach. The media was there. I quickly averted my eyes to the left, and behind the desk was Bud Leach, who was making the first fiberglass racquetball rackets in his garage. Leach beckoned me over with a nod and handed me a racket much like this one. "This is for you, Keeley. I'm giving one to all the participants." I shook hands with it, and there was a $20 bill wrapped around the handle. I stuck it in my pocket, and he said, "Why don't you use this in the tournament?" I said, "No, I want to do well in this tournament with the racket I'm accustomed to using. I'll accept your sponsorship, and I'm going to use my racket for this tournament." I made it to the semis against Charlie Brumfield. That was memorable for one reason. It was another hard-ruled Keeley versus Brumfield match, down to the wire. The matches then were best 2 out of 3 to 21 points. Late in the third game, at about 18-18, I hit a pass right. Charlie dove, swung wildly, and the ball disappeared from the court. We looked up in the gallery, we looked around the court, it was nowhere to be seen. We walked out the court with the racket dangling from Charlie's wrist. We got a drink, and I noticed that the ball was wedged in the throat of the racket. Charlie yelled for Bud Leach, "You've got to start stringing the crotch of these rackets." Charlie went on to become the second sponsored player by Leach Industries. History records that Charlie Brumfield was the first sponsored player by Leach, but it was actually me, because at the time, unbeknownst to him, I was accepting money under the table and had a verbal contract with Bud Leach. I settled into San Diego, lived with Charlie Drake in La Jolla, just north of San Diego, and racquetball started to boom. The ball got faster, the game got livelier, it went to 11-point third games. The Pro Tour started in 1973. I used my proceeds to buy my first new car, which is a '73 Chevy van. I had stenciled along the side Leach Industries, and that's how we traveled from tournament to tournament, the Leach team, all the way out to the Mississippi River and up to the Canadian border. I was also the first apparel-sponsored player in the country. At the time, I was wearing black Chuck Converse tennis shoes. I sprained my ankle and had to switch to a low-cut white at a Salt Lake tournament. So I did well in that tournament, wearing the low-cut white and the high-top black Converse. I switched as quickly as I could as soon as the swelling went down so I could get the high-top back on again, to different colored Converse tennis shoes, the old Chucks, and that caught the attention of Converse Company. They sent a representative out, and I signed a contract for the first apparel sponsored player for as many pairs of shoes that I wanted. I had them send me red ones and blue ones for the 4th of July tournaments, red and green ones for the Christmas tournaments, and for Halloween, brown and yellow. So I placed third in the nation in the National Singles Invitational. Pro Racquetball came along in 1973, and these were the golden years of racquetball from 1971 through about 75. I was known as an eccentric early in the sport, beside the jockstrap headband and the sweatpants. Now I wore Leach clothing, but I put special stencils on it. I put C12, H22, O11, which is the formula for sucrose, because I had read William Duffy's Sugar Blues, and other little messages that I wanted to deliver to the public when I played in tournaments around the country. And there were a lot of tournaments in the golden era of racquetball in the first half of the 70s decade. Every other weekend flew out to one of the main pro stops or to the satellite tournaments. Instead of playing for trophies and t-shirts, now we were playing for upwards of $50 for third place, $100 for second place, and $200 for first place. And that was a big thing then, because we also got a 3-day per diem, and we got food and lodging on top of that. One day, Chuck Leve of the National Racquetball Organization contacted me and said, "Will you write a book on racquetball?" Leve was instrumental in lining up that deal, along with Art Shea, who shot the photos for it. I wrote the book while living with Charlie Drake in La Mesa, California. I spent about 3 or 4 hours a day. I researched it very carefully. I wrote all the old paddleball players and champions, gathered what material I could from the existing archives, wrote a strong history section, the first that is quoted to this day for paddleball and racquetball, and then simply laid out what I had started teaching in lessons and clinics: strokes, serves, passes, ceiling balls, strategy. The Complete Book of Racquetball, published by DBI, Digest Books out of Chicago, did extremely well for a first book. It sold 200,000 copies. I was put on tour in the Midwest, radio, TV. There were Christmas with Keeley signs in clubs where I went, and the book was well promoted and fairly well written, if I could say so myself, because I had taken a formula from those dry scientific veterinary papers on bovine and equine medicine and injected humor per this formula. I wrote 10 paragraphs describing court coverage, and then interjected one humorous paragraph on something. It might be the overweight player with so many pimples from his diet, then when he walked, he popped his pimples. That was about the right ratio to keep people interested in the book, and it took off. And I got more requests for lessons and clinics. I was the first bona fide instructor in racquetball, courtesy of Bud Muehlheisen. Dr. Bud came to me one day in San Diego and said, "I have a job for you as instructor down at George Brown's, Trippy Brown's on 70th Street in La Mesa, California." I said, "I know how to do it, but I don't know how to teach it." He said, "Go in and clear the living room table and I'll show you how." He taught me how to hold the racket in a hand-shaped grip, how to use a horizontal stroke across the table, the intellectual aspects of strokes, serves, and strategies. I made notes, went down the next day, and taught my first lesson in racquetball. Because of these notes, and because I was used to dealing with various animals, and people are just upright animals, my style of teaching caught on quickly, and I was the foremost, and the only at the time, teacher of racquetball in San Diego. I made a living off of it. In fact, I had to turn lessons away. Waitresses showed up with pockets full of change, pilots with their $100 bills. Every morning from about 8 until noon, I taught at George Brown's. I also started the first clinics and camps ever in racquetball. My first camp was in San Diego with Steve Serot. It was a success in that we didn't make a lot of money, but there was quite a few participants and a lot of media. My second camp, about the same time in the heyday, in the early 70s, was in Steamboat Springs, and I held it for about 3 summers, a month-long camp. People came in from all over the place. I had my new Doberman Pinscher. Barbo there, who was just a puppy, ride the elevator up and down the condos, giving lessons in the players' rooms, and then they would come to the Steamboat Athletic Club, give group lessons there, and it took off and increased year after year until it became a very popular thing that I eventually turned over to save other players because it just got to be too stressful. I did clinics and instructions throughout the country at colleges, YMCAs, private clubs every other week for 2 or 3 years through 74 or 75, and got to see a lot of the country. Wherever I went, I always visited the zoo, the museum, the library, and the skid row. I eventually started hopping freight trains from clinic to clinic and camp to camp and thumbing my way as all part of instructing myself in the way that America worked. Brumfield and I invented some of the early shots in racquetball. There was no around-the-wall ball before us, at least it hadn't been named. There was no Z-ball, and we perfected the ceiling ball. The Z-ball was a curious thing, going usually from the left rear court up to the front corner, right side wall high, across the court to the three-quarter court, and straight across. A shot like that that's invented, or a new sports move, is useful for about a month or about 2 tournaments, and you could literally win, like with a new pitch in baseball, a World Series. So new shots like that we saved into important events, used them, players adapted, of course, and then for specifically for the Z-ball, they just waltzed up, took the Z out of the air before it hit the ground, straight off the left side wall, and the opponent, I having hit the Z-ball, was stuck behind them and lost a point. The around-the-wall ball and the Z-ball quickly went out of vogue, so we kept having to come up with new strategies to beat the field. Brumfield and I were at the top during the heyday, back and forth, first and second, mixed in there with very good players like Steve Serot, Steve Strandemo, and the new crop of younger players coming out. Rich Wagner, Davey Bledsoe. Shortly after that, around 74 or 75, the force from St. Louis moved in, including Jerry Hilecher, Jerry Zuckerman, Marty Hogan, and other very strong players. I lived with Marty Hogan in that golden era. We had a big house right on the beach of posh La Jolla. He had a room across from me on the first level. On the second level lived Charlie Drake, now risen to #1 Leach Industries as far as in the management term. Another guy named Ray Vera, come from Michigan State, and he was the engineer and product manager. So essentially Leach Industry was a Michigan product owned by Bud Leach and eventually turned over to Charlie Drake and Prokenix and others. Every time that Charlie and I invented a new shot, I would write it up. I had a series of new shots articles in Ace, then called Racquetball Magazine. The biggest kick I got out of being sponsored with Leach Industries was going on a trip to Taiwan. A gentleman named Kunan was the owner of Kunan Industries that made the most squash and badminton rackets in the world. Therefore it began to be called Kunan Leach. Celebrities started playing the game. The tournament draw sheets covered like wallpaper entire walls of clubs that you walked in, upwards of 500 to 1,000 players. I became a popular instructor as well as writer with about 100 stories, mostly instructional, also Keeleyisms, and I was still coming up with little theories and strategies of plays. One was called the black box theory. I envisioned a floating black box, and if I had a racket, this black box would move around with the player so that all he had to do was maneuver himself into the court so that the ball would enter this box like a strike zone in baseball, and then he would be allowed to hit it, and at that height he could hit in either direction, high or low, look the other way, and that was called the floating black box theory. I traveled the country throughout the early 70s by Leachmobile, by thumb, by bus, flew to some tournaments, but I preferred to be on the road. I developed the horizontal and vertical theories of racquetball on the road while I was hitchhiking. That is, and this is more important than it may sound initially if you think about it, in trying to hit any horizontal target, such as a bottom board of a front wall, if you swing level and the ball comes off the racket late, it'll go off to the left but still hit the bottom board. If you swing and hit early, it goes off toward first base and still hits the bottom board. Same thing in baseball, same thing in golf. Therefore, a horizontal swing begets a horizontal target, and you can't miss. You can use slingshot, rifle, throwing snowballs, throwing baseballs, and use a sidearm motion, and you'll hit the horizontal target every time. Also, during hitchhiking, I found out that when I was throwing stones at telephone poles, that when I used a overhand motion, I could hit a vertical target every time. That's because if there was an early release, I hit higher on the target, and a later release, I hit lower on the targets, always honing in on the vertical target. When Hogan and I lived together in San Diego, he just came out of St. Louis. He was a strong player, seemed like an honest guy. He didn't cheat me once, and I thought, I'll help this guy. The other thing I liked about him is everybody made fun of the way he swung. All of the top players used a towel wrapping tennis stroke. That is, it was a continuous, more or less, sweep of the arm with a wrist snap here where you could hear shh of the racket, as Muleisen used to say, and then the follow through. What Hogan did was contrary. Hogan towel snapped the ball. In other words, I refuse to undress for this video and use my shirt, but he snapped the towel. He cracked the whip. And at that crack, the head speed of the racket was double or triple, and that creates the increased air speed. And we were clocking them with police radar guns at the time. The top hitters were hitting, I think I hit 98 miles an hour, about the speed of a baseball pitcher, and he was hitting upwards of 121 miles an hour. People laughed at him for this, but he stayed with it, and that's the way I eventually began to teach. Hit the ball hard, not necessarily with maximum effort, but hard, and then hone in on the target, rather than the old method of aim for the target first and hit harder than harder. In other words, Hogan's stroke, his crack whip, swept the country. It began to be called the power stroke. When Marty and I were living together in La Jolla House, we practiced every day. We ran on the beach, and I gave him 10 points a game, or I used a wood paddle, and we played pretty even up. I actually threw my first match of my life in Burlington, Vermont, and let him beat me in 3 to get him a proper seed that he deserved in future matches, and the rest is history. In San Diego, I was a very disciplined trainer. I never really enjoyed racquetball, but I enjoyed the discipline of it, the athleticism, and training for it. I thought it went too fast. Once they went to the fastball, it changed from a thinking man's game to a knee-jerk response game. It was no longer long and lanky players like me. It was fireplugs that started winning. They lowered matches to best 2 out of 3 to 11, and then best 2 to 11, and that's when I eventually dropped out of the sport. My training regimen in San Diego daily was to get up in the morning at 8 o'clock, ride a bicycle 15 miles from La Mesa, California to the Pacific Ocean into the wind. I ran 7 to 9 miles on Pacific Beach from the jetty to the pier. Then I walked and got ice cream. Then I jogged up to Mel Gorham Sports Center about 3 blocks away on Turquoise Street, practiced racquetball for an hour. I played somebody for an hour, lifted weights for 45 minutes, went back down to the beach, got my bicycle. By then the wind had shifted into the opposite direction, rode an hour into the wind, inland, and of course I was still going to the bar at the time, so I jogged to the bar that night. Some other contributions I made to racquetball in the early 70s were co-owner of NRC, which is National Racquetball Clinics, that toured the country. I traded instruction in racquetball for various things, for 500 pounds of Purina dog chow in St. Louis, which was the home company for a tour of a box company, a tour of Trenway products. I was more concerned with having adventures and with learning things and meeting new people than I was in making money. In trade for instruction, I had lessons in meditation, 100 pounds of granola, all kinds of things. There used to be handicapped matches up in Washington at the Quickie Outhouse Open because oftentimes one player would be better than another at a clinic or in a tournament, and to make it competitive, they made one player, the better one of course, have a handicap such as I wore swim flippers once in a match. I dressed as Bozo the Clown. The hard part was the makeup on the face, and played in the Flint, Michigan Pro Stop and won the first round and maybe the second. Another handicap that was difficult was a backpack full of a 5-gallon jug of water, which only weighs 40 pounds, but it's sloshed around, so it made it difficult to move laterally. In a Chicago match, I was pitted against a gymnast, very stalwart fellow who did backflips and cartwheels in the court as we played. He was an A player, perhaps an open player. I was a pro. I could handle him easily, but I got enamored with these acrobats he was doing on the court. Racquetball becomes an art after a while. I had won enough national championships that I started molding the outcome of a match depending on who I played. For example, in the Chicago Pro Stop, I went against a good young player, and I liked him simply because he could eat as much food as I could, and he had big feet and at the same time moved around the court well. So I decided, well, I'm going to teach this guy one of my secrets of racquetball, which is positional racquetball. Now, I had read when I was a kid a Superman comic book in which the Bizarro people from Bizarro World, who do everything backwards, came in and played a basketball match against Superman and his team. The Bizarro team was superior physically, believe it or not, to Superman's team, but Superman's team had a strategy of positional ball where they had X's marked on the court. And if they were in a specific spot on the court or they wanted to make a shot, they went to that spot, and because they had practiced at those spots, it was swish, swish every time. So in racquetball, I developed the idea of different positions on the racquetball court and taking a certain shot from each of those positions. The criticism was another player, the defense is going to anticipate that. They never did. It just never happened. And my positions on the court were just behind the service line on the right side, in mid-court and rear court, and then the three same spots along the left-hand side wall. The three shots on either side would be always hit a kill shot when you're in front of your opponent from front court or the service box area or just behind the service line. When you're at mid-court, you tend to hit a pass, either cross-court or down the line. And when you're in rear court, near the back wall, especially when the ball is at chest height or higher, you go to the ceiling. It's the old sword and shield theory of racquetball. That helped a lot of beginning and intermediate players. They quickly found out that the name of the game is to shoot. And then the name of the game among the best of the best, the champions, were serve and shoot. That's the only way to become a universal champion and defeat both the Superman and the Bizarros, is to serve and shoot. In the Chicago tournament, I had developed a very good raw ball, R-A-W, run along the wall ball, in which along the left side wall, if I was left-handed, I would drop and hit a serve that slid and actually skid and rolled along the wall like wallpaper. And the opponent had to scrape it off with his racket, and it literally broke rackets and put me in an offensive position to end the rally in 2 shots. I had taken statistics and found out that among top players, the average rally lasted 2.1 shots. In other words, there's the serve return, and a little bit left over. What did that conclude? That it's a shooter's game. Out of that came the offensive theory of play. Simply, if you are able to kill any shot anywhere on the court, hit a kill shot. If you cannot hit a kill shot, for example, if you're tangled in your shoelaces or in deep court or tired or taking a head-high shot from near the back wall, then you hit the second most offensive shot, which is a pass. If the ball is above your head and there are no other options, then you hit the third most offensive shot, which is a ceiling ball. So most of the game is kills, next passes, and very few ceiling balls. The ceiling balls went out of vogue as the balls got livelier and livelier and started coming off the back wall for a routine roll-off off the back wall. As part of the handicaps, I started playing opposite-handed. I credited my strong point, my backhand, to writing so much. When you drag a pen across a piece of paper over and over and over again from left to right, it's the same as a backhand motion for the fingers, the wrists, the arms, the eyes, and neurological system. So I started writing left-handed because I wanted to start playing in tournaments left-handed. My dream was to enter a tournament right-handed as Steve Keeley and left-handed as Keith Steely and meet myself in the finals. And I nearly accomplished that at a pro stop in Michigan when I got to the semifinals and met myself. It's not easy to serve the ball in the service box right-handed, return it from deep court left-handed, run back to the service box, put the bracket in the right hand, hit the ball again, and to make a long story short, Keith Steely, the left-hander, won that, and then I lost in the finals left-handed. The ambidextrous play was a good ruse to go in a bar and bet a player that I could beat him in racquetball. It would be a top-notch player, of course, in a new city. And the bet was laid down. I go in and play the first game left-handed. They could tell I was playing as hard as I could. I'd lose it because they were very good. And then the money would be doubled for the second game, and I would switch to the right hand and then beat them. There were many bets at Milgorham Sports Center in the heyday of racquetball. Paul Haber beat Steve Strandemo with Haber wearing a walking cast on one of his legs, using his hands and a handball against Steve Strandemo's racket. In fact, Haber beat most of the top players in hands versus rackets because he had a left fist from deep court that ran along the left side wall that other players couldn't handle. Also, he was able to hop the ball on the serve that crossed players' eyes. Brumfield was able to play fairly even with Haber. Muehlheisen lost to Haber in the famous Sports Illustrated Mono Racquetta contest, and a lot of money was lost to the handball players by the racquetball players. I went in with Bud Muehlheisen to the PPA court in San Diego and watched him practice, and he says, "Look at this." And he wound up his patented Bud Muehlheisen forehand and hit the handball with his forehand about 160 miles an hour, and he says, "Nobody's going to keep up with that." Not that easy when the target is moving and the bullet is moving around the court and hopping around the court. In Memphis, Tennessee, Muehlheisen met Paul Haber in the mono versus Racquetta, and Haber beat him. Paul Haber in 2 exhibitions in a couple of different states and lost to him in each in the first game. But in the second game, I came back and won the third game out of attrition because I started using an around-the-wall ball that he couldn't use his fist on, and he couldn't cut it off. And I was the only player to beat Paul Haber in hands versus rackets. In the acrobat match in Chicago, I served a wallpaper serve along the left side with my backhand to the gymnast. He rushed as he should have, took the ball out of the air, did a cartwheel. I turned left, the ball hit straight on into my left eye, and I went down. I was completely blinded in the left eye. The treatment for that is immediate ice. Went to the locker room. It didn't really hurt, but I had no vision. The doctor on site came in and said, "You probably have a detached retina. I'd advise you to go immediately to the hospital." I said, "I just want to finish the match." I had won the first game. I lost the second game when I went back because I couldn't adapt. The guy wisely started hitting the ball to my left side, that is my blind side, and I couldn't see it anymore. I adapted in the third game tiebreaker by serving to the right, keeping play to the right. I won the match, went to the hospital. Indeed, I had a serious pulled retina and forfeited the tournament, got the vision back, and the fruit of that was I developed exercises for training peripheral vision. One of these was to start to read books upside down. For example, the last 400 books I've read have been upside down, which puts the print running from right to left and from bottom to top, sort of like Japanese, sort of like Chinese. Now when I started reading books from right to left, not only could I track racquetballs better, I could see cars coming from right to left a boxing glove, butterflies, a moving automobile. Another thing I did was to put on horse blinders to develop focus. In other words, I devised a cardboard headband like so that I couldn't see the ball unless it was within that narrow distance. They put blinders on horses like that to keep them calm, and it is a calming effect. So I wore these blinders in practice for a couple of weeks, as well as eye slits in cardboard, and developed a keen sense of focus. The girls in the tournaments I participated in used to raise their dresses and flash beavers at my opponents to distract them, but had they worn horse blinders, they wouldn't have had this problem. Racquetball was good to me, and I was good to racquetball. It was a mutualism throughout the golden days of the sport. But now the open road beckons here in Slab City on the shore of the Salton Sea, where I think I'll catch a freight train.
Great gets. Look how close he is. Lock and load, guys. Look at this. Look at this. I dare you to pass me. Oh! Unbelievable. Fantastic round.